You are listening to the Digital Parent Podcast with your host, Ced Lewis.
Welcome to another episode of the Digital Parent Podcast. In today's episode, we have my good friend, privacy expert Frederick Lane, to discuss his upcoming book, Cybertraps for Expecting Moms and Dads, where we break down how the radiation that comes from cell phones, tablets, laptops, wearable technology can really impact your pregnancy and cause harm to the newborn. So I hope you really enjoy this episode. Before we get into it, quick word from our sponsor, MSPI. Parents, MSPI is the ultimate monitoring tool for all devices. MSPI remotely tracks GPS locations, calls, text, messages, WhatsApp, Snapchat, web browsers, pictures, and much more. With MSPI, you can also restrict unwanted calls, block websites, or even block apps. Go to mspy.com for more information. Hey, Fred, welcome to the Digital Parent Podcast. We're so happy to have you on our show today.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Fred, we're really excited about your new book, Cybertraps for Expecting Moms and Dads, that's getting ready to be released on September the 1st. Can you give our audience a brief overview of the book and what led you to writing this type of book?
Sure. I began looking at the consequences of digital devices about 5 years ago when I wrote a book called Cybertraps for the Young. And it helped parents understand some of the legal risks that their kids face when they use, or in some cases misuse, digital devices. I then wrote a second book called Cybertraps for Educators, which looked at the same kinds of issues in schools and oftentimes between teachers and students. As I was working on that book, one of my friends was pregnant with her first child, and she was aware of the work that I had been doing. And she said that a lot of her fellow moms had questions about some of the risks of technology, some of the privacy issues that they should pay attention to. And so she said, why don't you write this book up? I think it would be something that a lot of mothers and expecting dads would like to know about.
And it's great because I think you cover a lot of great topics in the book. One of the things I want to kind of talk about is, wearable technology like Fitbits, things of that nature that you see a lot of pregnant moms wear during their pregnancy. Like with those type of devices, the radiation that comes from the Bluetooth from those devices, when you were doing your research on the book, does that type of, radiation and Wi-Fi stuff impact the pregnancy of the expectant mom?
That's a great question, and I was surprised at how much controversy there is about all of that. Basically, you've got three main types of radiation that expecting moms need to be concerned about. And actually, one of the interesting things, and I'll get into this, is that it's not just moms, but it's dads who want to be expecting dads need to be aware of this. But the three types of radiation that are out there are cellular radiation, and then the radio frequency radiations of Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, which are slightly different frequencies, but they're all within the radio frequency bandwidth for transmission. And the debate that occurs over this right now is that these kinds of radiation are what are called non-ionizing, which means that they're not strong enough to produce any direct changes in our cellular structure the way ultraviolet light does, or even high-end sunlight, visible light, which can cause skin burn and so forth, sunburn. And so most scientists will say to you, absolutely not. There is no impact by these types of radiation. But at the same time, this is exactly the same technology that is used in a microwave, although, again, at much, much lower power rates. And the issue that arises is that this kind of radiation does produce heating within our cells. And the debate that exists is whether or not over a long enough period of time, even low-level heating of the cells in our body has some effect on the physical health of those cells or their structure. And there are people who are very passionate about this, and they believe very strongly that there are concerns that people should be aware of. Again, the overwhelming scientific evidence suggests that there is no harm, but the thing that parents need to keep in mind is that most of our digital devices have really only been around for 10, 15, 20 years, and it often takes much longer for ill effects to appear. So, to be fair, we don't really know for certain. I think the odds are very strong that there's no effect, but it is definitely something that parents should talk about with their physicians or with their pediatricians. Now, I do want to get back to the guys, though, because one of the things that seems somewhat clearer is that men who are in the habit of carrying around their cell phone in their front pocket do reduce their fertility, because sperm cells in particular are very, very sensitive to heat. And so even a small increase in heat from the radiation of a cell phone or from its use or what have you can have an effect on a man's ability to conceive a child.
So, like, if you're working, you have two work phones. If you got one phone in your left, one phone in your right pocket, that's on all day long, then you really hurt your fertility rate, is what you're telling me.
You're not doing yourself any favors at all. That is absolutely true. Look, this is one of the reasons that guys are told, a little bit like pregnant women, if you're trying to have a baby, don't sit in a hot tub. Don't drive around with a heated car seat. The jokes that we have here in New York about people manspreading on the subway and taking up, two seats when they do that. There's actually a biological reason for that, because it cools off the guys and helps protect fertility. So, look, the some of this stuff, may seem a little bit silly, but it doesn't take much. And actually there's been a global concern about dropping fertility rates in general, which is definitely something that men should talk over with their physicians. And if that is in fact the case, then you really want to make sure that you don't add to your problems by carrying around these devices right next to your sperm factories.
Now, going back to the moms, are there any tips for them to kind of prevent any type of exposure when it comes to radiation to the newborn child?
Sure. I think, a lot of the logic is, let's talk first of all about pregnancy. It would, regardless of if you simply want to be cautious about this, which I think is legitimate, you want to think about keeping digital devices as far away from your stomach, your belly, as you can. And, in particular, because heat is also a factor, you don't want to lie in bed and rest your laptop on your stomach as the baby is, trying to grow. And then on top of that, one of the other things that I discovered during the course of my research is that as the fetus develops over a period of time, it is able to hear sounds. You may remember some years ago, actually, that there was a big push to get mothers to play Mozart while they were pregnant so their baby could listen to Mozart. Well, one of the things that scientists are discovering is that when your cell phone buzzes or vibrates or beeps or whatever, it actually disturbs the fetus's sleeping patterns, which can have some, consequences in terms of the baby's ability to rest and so forth. Once the baby is born, it's important to keep in mind that their skulls are much thinner than full-grown adults, and their tissue is generally more sensitive. So, again, the conclusion I reach is that even if you agree with scientists that the direct impact of the radiation is relatively low, I still think it makes sense to keep broadcasting devices like cell phones and Wi-Fi and Bluetooth as far as is practically possible away from infants.
So, Fred, what do you think about when the kids are really young, like from 0 to probably 2, and all these Wi-Fi or smart devices, they're out there with kids? Like, for example, there's that smart Barbie doll where, it records kid voices and thoughts, things of that nature. Do you think those devices pose a risk because it heavily is devoted to Wi-Fi resources?
Well, I think we've got three different issues that we could talk about with respect to that kind of technology. First of all is the transmission stuff. And again, when kids are 0 to 2 or 0 to 3, I'm not a big fan of putting these broadcasting devices so close to them, because I think, generally speaking, it's better to be safe than sorry, and let's minimize their exposure to radiation as much as possible in the first years of their life. Let's not kid ourselves. They're going to be surrounded by transmitting devices their entire lives. I mean, the kids that are being born now are smack dab in the middle of the 21st century. This is their life. So if we can delay as much as possible, I think that that's a good thing. The second thing that comes up with respect to that is the privacy issue, which is huge. You know, one of the things about the Smart Barbie is that device is specifically recording the quote-unquote conversations it has with the child, and those conversations are being uploaded to Mattel servers where they're analyzed and then are used by the doll to, speak back to the child. And I think there are some legitimate privacy concerns there in terms of what's being stored, how the information is being used, what kind of marketing might come out of it. Right now, at least, there's no indication that Smart Barbie is making toy recommendations to the child. But that's certainly...
But you know what it is, though, because I didn't even think about that. If you're saying that the information is being uploaded to Mattel's servers, they're analyzing what those kids are saying to develop new toys to market to those kids in their commercials.
Right, and do not kid yourself that is exactly what Mattel wants to do. So there's all of that. And then the third piece, which I talk about in some other aspects of my book, is the concern that pediatricians and child development specialists are raising about interaction with actual human beings. And one of the things I think that has moved the American Association of Pediatrics to recommend very minimal screen time is that we're seeing a generation of kids being raised with less and less visual and voice interaction with their parents, partly because the parents are so distracted themselves, and then partly because the parents, sometimes with the best of intentions, are putting tablets or cell phones in very young hands. The average age now of first device use is below 10 months, which is just stunning to me. And there is a lot of debate about what the implications of this will be. But one of the things that seems increasingly clear is concern that children who don't have adequate physical interaction actually are less empathetic. They have a harder time putting themselves in the shoes of other people and gauging the impact of their actions on other people. And we don't know yet what the full implications of that will be for our society as a whole, but I make a fairly strong argument that we need more empathy, not less.
Right, we do, because if they don't have empathy, then that leads to a lot of other issues down the road, such as bullying, fights, things of that nature, if they don't develop that at a young age.
That's exactly right, and those are all issues that I first started to write about in Cybertraps for the Young, and I'm trying to bring this all full circle so that we better understand the role that these devices are playing in all aspects of our lives.
Now, one of the things you also talk about in your book is about predators and people stealing pictures of baby bumps. And I know there's this thing called pregophilia out there where you have these perverts that really try to steal pictures of women when they're pregnant and they're putting on Instagram and Facebook. How big of an issue is this?
It's a pretty big issue, actually. Let's put one thing to rest first, though, that I think is really important. Headline writers like to talk a lot about, the physical predator, And I think people do need to understand that that risk is exceedingly small. The chances that someone is going to stumble across either your pregnant image or a newborn baby photo or something like that, and use that as a mechanism to cause physical harm is extremely unlikely. So that threat, I think, is way overblown by the media. But one of the things that I write about throughout the entire book is the idea that really the definition of privacy is the ability to control your information. And when you put anything online, in social media, on a website, in a blog, you lose the ability to control where that information goes. And unfortunately, it is absolutely true that there are people out there for whom pregnancy photos are a fetish. So they will sometimes pretend literally to be pregnant women to get other pregnant women to post photos in private forums or on Facebook groups or things like that. And then they will take those photos and they'll upload them to fetish websites. And that is disturbing, but it's not an actual threat. It's just upsetting, and it definitely is an invasion of privacy because you've lost control over how that image is being used. But I do think that people need to step back and understand, what the limits of the potential harm are. Much more disturbing and truly bizarre is this idea of digital kidnapping that has arisen. And I don't know if you've run across this, but
Definitely.
there have been a handful of incidents lately where mothers have discovered that individuals have captured a large number of photos of their child and have then presented themselves to the world as the parent of that child, and have created this entire parallel life in which there's no basis in reality whatsoever, but they're literally acting as the mother of this phantom child. And it's a very bizarre psychological thing. Again, it's deeply upsetting and disturbing and obviously wrong from an emotional and a legal perspective. But there's no indication that people are going the next step, to actually trying to locate the child and perform a physical kidnapping. But I think these kinds of cases really do underscore how risky it is, in a sense, to put this material online if you're a private person and you want to control who has access to your information. And as I say in the book, it's absolutely clear that Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and so on are trying to do a better job to give people that control. But it really only takes one mistake or one friend who decides to copy something, and you really don't know where that material will go.
Hey, I think that's a good point because, like you said right there with digital kidnapping, it's really not a threat. But based upon all these apps having geolocation features within the app,
right,
who knows at what point somebody may take it to the next level and steal a picture saying, you know what, this kid actually lives 20 miles from me. Maybe I should go and steal this kid. So even though it hasn't happened yet, but there still seems to be a potential that it could happen somewhere down the road. So we have to be careful as parents put the information up.
Right, and that's one of the tips that I offer parents is that, at the very least, they need to turn off the geolocating feature when they take photographs. But nobody should have any illusions about how easy it is to figure out where someone lives, even if you've done that. So there's actually a fairly large number of people, and I would argue even a growing number of people, who are finding alternative ways to share photos with their family. For instance, using a private Dropbox account or Google photo albums that you literally share with a select number of people that you truly trust. And actually, I'm a huge fan of Google Photos for doing this. I just did that with a family cookbook. And so I photographed the entire book. And then I can send a link to that album just to the people that I want to view that cookbook, and nobody else can see it. I mean, the alternative would be to, obviously create some kind of social media thing, but then I'd have no idea of where that information would go.
Right. One other thing I wanted to talk about, Fred, was this new trend, I guess, of parents like crowdsourcing the names of their kids before they're born, like, asking people on different social media sites to kind of help them come up with a name. Is that like a privacy issue?
Well, actually, I was I was really surprised by that because I named kids 23 years ago, and it never would have occurred to me to try to get a group of people together to name the kid. But yeah, there have been a few people who have done that, and I think it's more just kind of a geek thing. They tend to be software engineers who think it would be kind of funny. It's not really a huge privacy issue per se for the kid. I think that, it gets to the issue of identity, which we can talk about in a minute, in the sense that now the kid already has a public persona, right? They're part of this, internet news feed, and that's really part of their life story now. Look, I think honestly that for expecting moms and dads who are trying to pick out a name for their kid, there are legitimate reasons to use the internet as a resource. For starters, there are a ton of different websites out there that can give you suggestions and so forth. The privacy implications arise in that many of those websites want personal information from you in exchange for using their resources. And then they use that information, obviously, to target advertisements to you for baby-related products. If that doesn't bother you, that's totally fine. But, people do need to understand that there really is no such thing as a free lunch on the internet. And if you're not paying for a service, then typically you're paying with personal information. So it's typically one or the other. The other issue that arises with respect to naming that I think parents should pay attention to is that given the fact that our kids are going to be so much online and so internet enabled, it does make sense to think about their name in internet terms. So at the very least, you might want to Google the names that you are thinking of to see what comes up. One of the stories that I wrote about was a couple that had a handful of names, and one of them was associated with a porn star.
Oh, wow.
So they decided, as much as they liked the name, they didn't want those being the search results when her college application went out or something like that. Other people look to whether or not their kid can reserve a domain name. So, are they going to want to be, fredericklane.com, which obviously is taken, but do they have, some other variation on the name that would allow them to establish their own website? Others look at, well, my kid's going to want to have a Google Mail account. Do we, change the name a little bit so that he or she can do that? These are all legitimate considerations. I think you can go a little bit overboard with all of it. And that's really up to each individual couple to make up their minds.
But you know what, Fred? I think that's an excellent point because I know a lot of parents who named their kid back in the day ISIS. I think if they would have did a Google search, it would have been the best, idea to name your kid ISIS now.
Well, nobody would name their kid ISIS now, right? And it's a huge bummer for those kids who are 25 years old, right?
Right.
Right, that's absolutely true. Or, I don't think there'll be many Jenner families naming their kid Bruce anytime in the future, or, Caitlin for that matter. It just gets very complicated. And, in terms of Google, there's an interesting choice for parents to make, right? Because do you want to give your kid a name that is effectively a unique Google result, right? Because it's got unusual spelling or it's very different. Or do you want to give your kid the ability to get lost in the crowd a little bit? Do you give them a name? Jon Smith is the obvious example. What was the statistic I saw? Something like 2.3 million John Smiths in the United States, something
Wow.
ludicrous like that. So you name your kid John Smith and they go and they get Googled, it'll be hard to find them. So that's really a value choice for parents to think about.
Fred, are there any other helpful tips for parents in your book that they should take away?
Well, I think what people will find when they read this book is that for each of the topics that I've covered, I try to give them a handful of suggestions or things to think about. One of the things that I think is important, and I finished the book with this, is for parents to sit down and write out what I call a digital birth plan. A lot of couples that are working with, particularly midwives or, sort of understanding hospitals, will write out a birth plan that talks about how they want their birthing process to go. And it occurred to me that when a couple is expecting a baby, one of the things that they should do is to sit down and talk through these different issues. For instance, how many photos of our baby will we post on social media? Are we going to, FaceTime our birth, which some people have done? Are we going to go Facebook Live with it? How are we going to choose a baby name? So on and so forth. So what I've done is I've put together a list of 50 or 60 different questions that parents can, choose to answer or not, but which give them some idea of the kinds of issues that may come up during the course of a pregnancy. And it's actually really surprising how many different technology-related issues pop up.
That's excellent. So, Fred, where can people find the book when it comes out on September the 1st?
As of September the 1st, it will be available on Amazon in both Kindle and print-on-demand version.
Will it also be available on your website?
Well, through my website, yes. I'll put links on fredericklane.com that will take people directly to the site on Amazon.
And are there any other places that people can find you on social media to, find all the other Cybertrap books that you read in the past?
Well, that's a great question. Thank you. Yes, there are links to all of my books on my website, fredericklane.com. And then people can also follow me on Twitter at FSL3. And then there's also material about my books on Facebook if they just search for my book titles.
Well, great. Fred, we appreciate you being on the show, and best of luck with that new book.
I really appreciate this. You were the first interview, and I'm psyched to get it started.
Parents, I hope you really got a lot out of this episode with Frederick Lane. If you want more information, please go to his website, fredericklane.com. That's where you can pre-order his book, Cybertraps for Expecting Moms and Dad. And he also has an excellent digital birthday guide that will give you step-by-step ways to avoid the pitfalls and some of the things we talked about on the podcast. And as always, please go to iTunes, subscribe to the Digital Parent Podcast, and please leave us a review. Until the next time.